53 million people. That is what China's official Tang census recorded in the year 754 AD, the year before the disaster. By 764 AD, the same administrative apparatus counted 17 million. 36 million people had vanished from the official record in a single decade. Not all of them died. Some fled. Some hid from tax collectors in the mountains. Some were absorbed into the private estates of warlords who had no interest in letting the state count their labor force. But the scholars who have studied this collapse most closely, Denys Twitchett in the Cambridge History of China, Edwin Pulleblanc in his foundational work on the rebellion's origins, conclude that the mortality alone was staggering. Conservative estimates place the dead at 13 million. Higher estimates reach 36 million. By either count, the An Lushan rebellion of 755 to 763 AD was one of the deadliest events in all of premodern history. Not the fall of Rome, not the Black Death. What happened in Tang China? And what makes this figure almost impossible to process is the context from which it fell. In 754 AD, the Tang Dynasty was not a civilization in decline. It was the most sophisticated, most cosmopolitan, most culturally productive society on Earth. Its capital, Chang'an, held roughly 1 million people within its walls, the largest city on the planet by a significant margin. The Silk Road was operating at its maximum historic capacity. Caravans brought glass from Persia, cotton from India, horses from Fergana, spices from the Indonesian archipelago, and in return sent silk, porcelain, paper, and tea west across the Tarim Basin toward Constantinople and Baghdad. Chang'an's western markets had shops run by Sogdian, Persian, and Arab merchants. Its Buddhist temples contained texts translated from Sanskrit by Chinese monks who had walked across Central Asia to retrieve them. Its court poets, Lai Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, were producing verse that Chinese readers would still memorize 1,500 years later. This was not a civilization in distress. This was a civilization at its apex. And then a Sogdian-Turkic general named An Lushan, commanding 150,000 men in the frozen northeast, turned his army south. The story of how that happened, why a dynasty at its peak could be so catastrophically vulnerable, how a single rebellion could cut the population count by a third, and why the Tang that emerged from 8 years of civil war was a hollowed-out ruin of the dynasty that had entered it, is the story of the specific, traceable decisions and structural failures that turned administrative genius into institutional collapse. It is not a story about inevitable decline. It is a story about choices. About the choice to trust a man no one should have trusted. About the choice to execute the 2 generals who might have stopped him. And about all the choices made in the 70 years after the rebellion that made the dynasty's final death in 907 AD, something almost everyone saw coming long before it arrived. The Tang Dynasty was founded in 618 AD, born from the same chaos that had consumed the short-lived Sui. Lai Yuan, the man history would call Emperor Geazu, was a Sui aristocrat and military governor who leveraged his position on the northwestern frontier to raise a rebellion when the Sui's catastrophic Korean campaigns and forced labor projects had emptied the dynasty's legitimacy. He took Chang'an with relatively little resistance. He declared the Tang. He reigned for 9 years before his son, engineered one of the cleanest successions in Chinese imperial history, clean in the sense of being extremely efficient, and brutal in the sense of what that efficiency required. Lai Shimin, who became Emperor Taizong, killed his 2 brothers and 20 of his nephews in the Xuanwu Gate incident of 626 AD and forced his father to abdicate. As an act of fratricidal consolidation, it was the standard method. What made Taizong exceptional was what he did afterward. He was, by the scholarly consensus across 2 centuries of Tang studies, one of the most capable rulers in Chinese history. He rebuilt the examination system, attracted the most talented men in the empire to his court regardless of their family background, maintained a genuine openness to criticism from his ministers that was rare enough in Chinese imperial governance to be remarked upon in his own lifetime, and pursued a foreign policy that extended Tang influence in every direction simultaneously. He crushed the Eastern Turkic Khaganate in 630 AD, an achievement that caused the various steppe peoples to confer on him the title Heavenly Khagan, ruler not just of China, but of the nomadic world as well. The Silk Road, which the Sui's instability had disrupted, reopened fully under Tang protection. The dynasty that Taizong built did not immediately collapse after his death in 649 AD. His successors included Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to rule not as regent, but as emperor in her own name, from 690 to 705 AD. A figure whose governance was genuinely competent even as the male Confucian establishment of later centuries tried to write her off as a usurper, and a succession of capable if less brilliant emperors who kept the Tang machine running. But it was the reign of Xuanzong, Emperor Minghuang, the brilliant emperor, who reigned from 712 to 756 AD, that defined the dynasty's peak, and through the decisions of his final decade, guaranteed its catastrophic fall. Xuanzong's first 3 decades of rule were a genuine golden age. He cleared the court of the factional infighting that had destabilized the succession years, brought efficient administrators into the key positions, expanded the examination system, and presided over an era of economic growth that filled the imperial granaries to historically unprecedented levels. The Silk Road commerce that had been Tang's lifeline from the beginning expanded further under his reign. The cosmopolitan character of Chang'an deepened. Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and Islam all had official temples in the capital alongside the Buddhist monasteries and Taoist shrines. Foreign musicians played in the court entertainments. Foreign fashions circulated in the markets. The Tang Empire was not just large, it was porous in the way that only genuinely self-confident civilizations can afford to be. The poetry that flourished in Xuanzong's Chang'an was not court flattery. Li Bai wrote with a freedom and a wildness that reflected a society confident enough to tolerate irreverence. Du Fu wrote with a moral precision that reflected a society that took the Confucian ethical framework seriously as a standard against which reality could be measured, and found wanting. Wang Wei wrote with a Buddhist quietude that reflected a society sophisticated enough to hold multiple spiritual frameworks simultaneously without anxiety. What these 3 poets share, beyond their individual genius, is the assumption that the world they inhabit is stable, that the Tang is the permanent setting within which human life unfolds. Du Fu, who was a young man during the peak years and a middle-aged man during the catastrophe, spent the second half of his life writing about what it felt like when that assumption was violently disproved. The structural problem that would destroy Xuanzong's achievement had been building for decades before he recognized it. The Tang military system had been constructed on a foundation called the Fubing, conscript soldiers recruited from free peasant households, trained locally, equipped at state expense, and rotated through garrison duty before returning to their farms. This system had worked when the empire's external frontiers were relatively compact and when the campaigns being fought were relatively short. By the early 8th century, neither condition applied. The Tang was fighting sustained campaigns on multiple fronts simultaneously, against the Tibetan Empire in the west, which had become a serious military power under its own imperial dynasty, against the Arab Abbasid Caliphate, which was pushing into Central Asia, against Khitan and Zhai confederations in the northeast, against the Nanzhao Kingdom in the southwest. The Fubing system could not sustain these commitments. Conscripts rotated through garrison duty resented the distance from their farms. Supply lines to the frontier were enormously expensive. The quality of troops raised locally and equipped minimally was inadequate against the professional cavalry of the steppe confederations. By the 720s, the Tang had effectively abandoned the Fubing in favor of professional standing armies stationed on the frontier under the command of regional military governors called Jiedushi. These governors commanded not just armies but the administrative, fiscal, and logistical infrastructure of their frontier zones. They recruited their own soldiers, paid them from locally collected revenues, and commanded their personal loyalty. It was a solution to an immediate military problem. It was also, as subsequent events would demonstrate, the most dangerous structural change the Tang made in the 8th century. Professional armies loyal to their generals rather than to the imperial center are, historically, a form of power that tends to outlast the emergency that justified them. The Jiedushi who commanded Tang's northeastern frontier were not imperial servants in the way that the Han prefects had been imperial servants. They were regional military lords who happened, for the moment, to direct their efforts in the service of Tang goals. An Lushan was the most spectacular beneficiary of this system. He was born sometime around 703 AD to a Sogdian mother, Sogdiana being the merchant civilization of Central Asia, centered on Samarkand, which served as the cultural middleman of the Silk Road, and a Turkic father. He grew up in the multi-ethnic frontier world of the northeastern border, spoke multiple languages, and built a career as a military officer serving Tang commanders in campaigns against the Khitan and Zhai confederations. He was physically large, personally charming in the bluff, direct manner that military men found reassuring, and politically intelligent in ways that were not immediately obvious. He rose through the frontier officer corps by a combination of genuine military competence and strategic cultivation of his superiors. His superiors, eventually, included Emperor Xuanzong himself. How An Lushan gained access to the imperial court is a matter that even the best Tang scholarship treats with some uncertainty, but by the 740, he was making regular visits to the capital and cultivating Xuanzong's favor with a theatrical directness that the emperor found entertaining. He was fat, enormously fat by the standards of Tang court culture, which associated slenderness with refinement, and he played on this deliberately, presenting himself as a jovial barbarian, funny and harmless and wholly devoted to the emperor. There are accounts, whose historical reliability is contested but whose cultural significance is clear, of An Lushan addressing Yang Guifei, Xuanzong's beloved consort, as his mother, and of Yang Guifei adopting him in a ceremonial bath, as though this great general were her infant son. Whether this happened exactly as described or not, it reflects the nature of the relationship. An Lushan had found his way into the emperor's domestic circle, the space of trust and intimacy that surrounded Xuanzong's private life. Yang Guifei, Yang Guifei, was the most famous woman in Tang history, and arguably the most consequential. She entered the imperial harem as a secondary consort in the early 740, and within a few years had become Xuanzong's exclusive obsession. She was genuinely beautiful. The Tang sources are emphatic on this, and while beauty in court descriptions is a conventional compliment, the consistency of the emphasis across sources suggests something real. But what seems to have captivated Xuanzong more was her musical intelligence. She played the pipa, composed and danced, and shared Xuanzong's passion for music and performance in a way that made her a companion as well as a consort. The emperor in his 60s had found in her something that the formal machinery of imperial life could not provide: genuine personal pleasure. Her rise drew her family into power. Her cousin, Yang Guifei, was a man of moderate administrative talent and unlimited personal ambition, and Yang Guifei's position gave him access that his abilities alone would never have secured. By the early 750s, Yang Guifei had maneuvered himself into the position of chief minister, the most powerful administrative office in the Tang state, and was using that position to enrich himself, settle personal scores, and conduct a government that satisfied its paperwork requirements, while failing to address the structural pressures building on every frontier. An Lushan and Yang Guifei hated each other with a specificity that suggests the hatred was grounded in real observation rather than mere factional rivalry. An Lushan understood, correctly, that Yang Guifei had no serious military capacity and was governing through a combination of family connection and bureaucratic positioning. Yang Guifei understood also correctly that An Lushan was building an independent power base that had no loyalty to the dynasty as an institution, and that would eventually conflict with the central government's authority. Yang Guifei repeatedly warned Xuanzong that An Lushan was planning a rebellion. Xuanzong, who had built his relationship with An Lushan over 15 years of careful cultivation, dismissed the warnings. He trusted the fat general who called his consort mother. By the early 750s, An Lushan controlled 3 of the Tang's northeastern frontier military commands: Fanyang in the northeast, Pinglu on the coast, and Hedong in the center. He commanded, by various contemporary estimates, somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 professional soldiers, battle-hardened cavalry who had spent years fighting the Khitan and Zhai confederations, and who were loyal to him personally rather than to the Tang court. No single loyalist commander in the Tang's interior provinces commanded anything close to this concentration of professional military force. The interior garrisons had been neglected for decades in favor of the frontier armies. The Fubing had decayed. The Tang's military weight was almost entirely concentrated on its edges, under men like An Lushan. On the 16th day of the 11th month of 755 AD, December 16, by the Western calendar, An Lushan declared that he was marching south to destroy the traitorous minister Yang Guifei in the emperor's name. It was the standard formula for a rebellion that everyone understood was a rebellion, a performance of loyalty as cover for treason. His army moved south from Fanyang with a speed that made the defense of the interior provinces nearly impossible before it could be organized. The Tang court's response to the initial reports was disbelief, then panic, then the commission of what historians have identified as the single most catastrophic command error of the entire crisis. 2 experienced military men, the generals Gao Xianji and Feng Changqing, were sent to the strategic pass of Tongguan, the great natural choke point in the mountains west of Luoyang through which any army moving from the northeast toward Chang'an must pass. Tongguan was genuinely defensible. A determined garrison at that pass could hold against a much larger force indefinitely, giving the Tang time to organize a coherent response. Gao Xianji and Feng Changqing assessed the situation, recognized that their forces were not ready for open-field combat against An Lushan's battle-hardened cavalry, and made the strategically sound decision to hold the pass rather than advance. Xuanzong, receiving his battlefield reports through the distorting lens of Yang Guifei and terrified court eunuchs who reported that the generals were cowards and defeatists, had both men executed, not relieved of command, executed, at Tongguan, in front of their troops. The garrison that then held the pass was subsequently commanded to advance into open country against An Lushan's army, exactly as the dead generals had argued it should not do. It was destroyed. Luoyang, the Tang's eastern capital, had fallen in January 756 AD, barely a month after the rebellion began. Chang'an, the imperial capital, fell in July 756 AD. The speed was directly caused by the removal of the 2 men who had the pass defended. Xuanzong fled. The imperial court loaded what it could onto wagons and horses and moved southwest toward Sichuan, toward the mountain-ringed basin that had sheltered Chinese rulers in past emergencies. They traveled the Shu Road, the same mountain path that Du Fu would later describe in verse as barely passable in dry conditions, impassable in everything else, with the dust of Chang'an still visible behind them. They did not get far before the second catastrophe of the summer of 756 AD struck. At Mawei postal station, 3 days' march from Chang'an, the imperial guard mutinied. The proximate cause was Yang Guifei, who was recognized by Tibetan envoys traveling in the same convoy and who, in the resulting confrontation, was killed by soldiers. The guard then surrounded Xuanzong's traveling chamber and demanded something more. They had been marching for days. They knew the capital had fallen. They understood that the dynasty's situation was catastrophic, and they understood, with the clarity that soldiers have when careers and lives are at stake, that Yang Guifei had been at the center of the patronage network that had elevated the untrustworthy and destroyed the competent. They demanded her death. Xuanzong, 72 years old and watching his empire collapse, was forced to agree. Yang Guifei was led to a courtyard by the side of the road. A eunuch strangled her with a white silk scarf. She was perhaps 38 years old. Xuanzong reportedly wept. He could not have been under any illusion about what it meant that his own guard had just dictated terms to him. The political relationship between emperor and army, the basic foundation of imperial authority, had inverted in a dirt courtyard next to a relay station. The rescue of the Tang came from two directions, and both of them would cost the dynasty more than the rebellion itself. Xuanzong's son, Prince Xuanzong, broke from the imperial convoy and rode north to Lingwu, in the Ordo's steppe region, where he declared himself emperor. The rebellion had been launched against Yang Guifei, not against the Tang Dynasty as such, and Xuanzong understood that if there was going to be a loyalist resistance, it needed an emperor at its head, a source of legitimacy that could organize the scattered Tang garrisons and the regional commanders who had not gone over to An Lushan. Xuanzong, informed of his son's action, formally abdicated in Xuanzong's favor. The old emperor continued to Sichuan and spent the remainder of his reign in comfortable and evidently miserable retirement, writing poetry about the woman he had been forced to kill. Xuanzong made the alliance that would retake the capitals. He negotiated with the Uyghur Khaganate, the dominant power on the eastern steppe, successors in that region to the Turkic Khaganates that Taizong had destroyed, and obtained Uyghur cavalry in exchange for promises that, when the capitals were retaken, the Uyghurs would be allowed to loot them. It was an agreement that reflected the absolute desperation of the Tang position. The Uyghur cavalry was genuinely decisive, heavy steppe horsemen against whom An Lushan's army, for all its professional quality, could not maintain formation. Chang'an was retaken in the autumn of 757 AD. Luoyang was retaken early in 757 AD. Both cities were sacked by the Uyghurs for 3 days each, as promised. The people of the Tang capitals, who had survived An Lushan's occupation only to be delivered to the mercies of allied looters, did not easily forget who had made that bargain. An Lushan himself did not live to see the capitals retaken. In early 757 AD, he was murdered by his own son, and Kingsu, reportedly during a drunken argument in which An Lushan, whose health had deteriorated badly, he suffered from what contemporaries described as failing eyesight and extreme irritability, possibly diabetes, struck Kingsu in a rage and Kingsu killed him. The rebellion continued without him, passing to Shi Siming, one of An Lushan's senior generals and a figure of comparable military talent, who proved even more difficult to defeat than his predecessor. Shi Siming was also eventually murdered by his own son, Shi Kaoi, in 761 AD. The rebellion's commanders kept killing each other in ways that suggest the movement had never been about ideology or dynasty building in any coherent sense. It was about personal power, and personal power produces personal violence when the stakes are high enough. The rebellion formally ended in 763 AD when Tang forces and their Uyghur allies finally suppressed the last of the rebel commanders. 8 years. The territory that had been fought over, the North China Plain, the Yellow River Basin, the Huai River Valley, had been ground through by successive armies, counterattacks, retreats, sieges, and the famines that follow when armies eat everything in their path. Poulablanc's analysis of the demographic data suggests that the northeastern provinces, which had been among the most densely populated regions of the Tang Empire before 755 AD, lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of their population in those 8 years. Du Fu, who traveled through the devastated provinces as a middle-aged man in the years after the rebellion, wrote about empty cities, unburied bones, mothers separated from children, fields of wheat that no one was left to harvest. What returned after 763 AD was not the Tang Dynasty as it had existed before. It was something wearing the Tang's clothes. The most fundamental change was structural. The Tang could not reconquer the Northeast. The military governors who had governed the rebel territories, or who had governed neighboring territories and survived the war by carefully managing their relationship with both sides, were now entrenched. They had armies. They had administrative bureaucracies. They had revenue streams independent of the central government. They had, in many cases, hereditary succession claims to their commands that they intended to maintain. The Tang negotiated with them. The formal arrangement was that they retained their titles and commands in exchange for nominal submission. The substance was that the Northeast was effectively autonomous, a collection of hereditary military satrapies that paid lip service to Tang sovereignty and kept everything else. The political science term that Denys Twitchett uses for this outcome is fragmented sovereignty. The Tang retained control of the Yangtze Valley and the south, which had not been heavily affected by the rebellion, and remained the empire's economic heartland. It retained some control of the northwest, though the Tibetan Empire had used the chaos of 756–763 to seize enormous chunks of Tang territory in the Gansu corridor, cutting off the overland Silk Road routes to Central Asia. It had formal sovereignty over the northeast without the ability to enforce it. The empire that had measured 60 administrative circuits in 740 AD was, by 780 AD, an empire in name over a territory it could not fully govern. The eunuchs completed the picture. The An Lushan rebellion had shattered the confidence of the Tang emperors in the regular military, in the provincial governors, and in many cases in the civil officials who had failed to predict, prevent, or competently manage the crisis. What the emperors trusted after 763 AD was what they could see and control directly. The palace armies, the Shen's army, the imperial guard forces stationed in and around Chang'an. By the late 8th century, command of these palace armies had passed into the hands of the eunuchs, the men who, as in the hand before them, had the emperor's daily trust because their entire existence was bounded by his household, and their power derived entirely from his favor. The eunuchs commanding palace armies were a structural novelty that the early Tang had specifically avoided. Taizong had prohibited eunuchs from holding military command. The decision to permit it after 763 AD was a direct response to the discovery that external generals could not be trusted. The cure created a different disease. By the early 9th century, eunuch commanders controlled the most effective military force in the Tang's interior. They used that control to influence succession, to eliminate rivals, to extort cooperation from the civil bureaucracy, and to make and unmake emperors with a regularity that the civil officials found infuriating and the emperors found terrifying but were unable to change. Several emperors who attempted to break the eunuch's power found themselves suddenly, briefly, and permanently replaced. The Uyghur relationship generated its own long-term crisis. The cognate that had rescued the Tang expected payment, and the payment it extracted was structured in a way that ground down Tang finances for the better part of a century. The most damaging instrument was the silk for horses exchange. The Uyghurs delivered horses at prices they set, and the Tang paid in silk, with the exchange rate consistently weighted in the Uyghurs' favor. The Tang needed horses for its cavalry, and after the Gansu corridor was lost to Tibet, the Uyghur route was the primary supply. The Tang could not negotiate the price because it could not afford to lose the supply. It paid. Year after year, silk flowed north to the Uyghur steppe in quantities that the Tang treasury found genuinely painful. The great commercial economy of the Mid-Tang was being bled slowly by the cost of the alliance that had saved it. The Uyghur crisis resolved not through Tang policy, but through steppe politics. The Yenisei Kyrgyz destroyed the Uyghur Khaganate in 840 AD, ending the tribute demands along with the horse supply. The immediate effect was the liberation of the Tang from an extortionate creditor. The medium-term effect was the loss of its most reliable cavalry source at exactly the moment when the dynasty's internal situation was deteriorating toward the second catastrophe. Huang Chao was a salt smuggler from Shandong. Salt, in Tang China, was a state monopoly, taxed, regulated, and enormously profitable to the state. The smugglers who operated in the margins of this system were not petty criminals. They ran substantial organizations, had their own armed escorts, and maintained networks that reached across provincial lines. Huang Chao had failed the imperial examination multiple times, a detail that the Chinese literary tradition finds significant. The man who should have been brought inside the system through the meritocratic path and was instead forced outside it. Whether his examination failures were the psychological origin of his later rebellion is speculative. What is clear is that by the 870s, when the Tang's institutional decay had produced another cycle of peasant displacement, provincial instability, and state incapacity, Huang Chao had the organizational network, the resources, and the ruthlessness to build a rebellion at scale. The Wang Xianji rebellion of 874 AD was the spark. Wang Xianji, another salt-smuggler, launched an uprising in Shandong that Huang Chao joined. When Wang Xianji was killed in 878 AD, Huang Chao inherited the movement's military force and redirected it south. He moved with a speed and operational flexibility that the Tang provincial forces were unable to match. He marched through Jiangxi into Fujian and then turned south and west toward Guangzhou, Canton, the great southern port city through which the maritime Silk Road's riches flowed. Guangzhou in 879 AD was among the most cosmopolitan cities in the Tang Empire. Arab and Persian merchants had established permanent communities there, running the spice and luxury goods trade that the Tang's access to the sea had made possible. Contemporary Arab sources, including the geographer Al-Yaqubi and the merchant account known as the Relation of China and India, describe a thriving community of Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians living in the port district under Tang commercial law. When Huang Chao took Guangzhou in 879 AD, his army killed them. The Arab geographer Al-Masudi, writing in the 10th century from accounts of those who survived, states that 120,000 foreign merchants were killed in Guangzhou. This figure is certainly an exaggeration, but the massacre was real. It ended Guangzhou's role as an international port for decades and sent a shock through the Arab and Persian merchant communities of the Indian Ocean world that reshaped trade routes westward. Huang Chao turned north again. The Tang military, fragmented among competing Jiedushi who were more concerned with their own territorial positions than with a coordinated loyalist response, could not stop him. He moved up through Hunan and Jiangxi, crossed the Yangtze, swept through the Huai River Valley, and in 880 AD took Luoyang. He reached Chang'an in the last days of December 880 AD. The Tang Emperor Xuanzong fled to Sichuan, the same mountain refuge to which Xuanzong had fled in 756 AD. As though the Tang's disasters were a script being replayed, Huang Chao entered Chang'an and declared himself the founding emperor of the great Tang Dynasty. He held the city for nearly 4 years, from December 880 to the spring of 884 AD. The occupation was brutal. Contemporary sources describe systematic looting, the execution of Tang officials who could be found, and periodic massacres in response to resistance. Chang'an, which had been partially rebuilt after the devastation of the An Lushan rebellion, was now stripped and burned more completely. The city that had been the world's largest a century and a half earlier, the city that had drawn Silk Road merchants from Central Asia and India and Persia, the city whose Western markets had been the crossroads of the ancient world, that city ceased to exist as a functioning metropolis. It would never be a major capital again. The Tang did not retake Chang'an through its own military effort. It hired Lai Qiang. Lai Qiang was the son of a Sogdian-Turkic chieftain who had served the Tang on the northeastern frontier. He commanded Sogdian cavalry, among the most effective military force in northern China in the 880, and he accepted the Tang commission to suppress Huang Chao with the enthusiasm of a professional soldier, offered excellent terms. He drove Huang Chao out of Chang'an in 883 AD. Huang Chao retreated east, continued fighting for another year, and was finally killed in 884 AD, reportedly by his own nephew when his position became hopeless. The Tang emperor returned to Chang'an and found a ruin. More precisely, the emperor returned to what was left of Chang'an and began governing from a dynasty that was now entirely dependent on warlords it could not control. Lai Qiang held the northeast. Other Jiedushi held their own territories. The central government in Chang'an was a residual institution, maintaining the ceremonies of the Tang, issuing titles and appointments that the recipients accepted when convenient and ignored when not, collecting revenue from the portions of the empire that had not been absorbed by the autonomous military governors. Into this residual institution stepped Zhu Wen. Zhu Wen had been one of Huang Chao's generals, not a Shachuo Turk, not a frontier commander, but a man who had risen from within the rebellion itself. In 882 AD, he defected to the Tang. The defection was not ideological. Zhu Wen was a pragmatic man who had assessed the rebellion's prospects and concluded that the winning side was not Huang Chao. The Tang rewarded his defection generously. He was given command of Xuanwu, the military governorship centered on Kaifeng in the Central Plains. From that base, he spent the following 2 decades building the most formidable military-political machine in China. Zhu Wen was not subtle. He was a gifted military commander and an entirely ruthless political operator who saw the Tang's eunuch-controlled court as an obstacle rather than a legitimate authority. In 903 AD, he moved against the eunuchs. Zhu Wen's men entered the imperial palace and killed approximately 700 of the Tang's palace eunuchs in a single operation. The eunuch faction that had dominated Tang politics for more than a century, that had controlled the Shen's army and made and unmade emperors, was effectively exterminated in an afternoon. Emperor Xuanzong, who was at the time Zhu Wen's effectively captive ruler, reportedly received the news without visible distress. He had spent his reign being controlled by eunuchs who saw him as a tool. Now he was controlled by a warlord who saw him as a tool. The change in management did not improve his circumstances. Zhu Wen had the emperor move to Luoyang in 904 AD, away from the residual networks in Chang'an, closer to his own power base. Later that year, he had Emperor Xuanzong assassinated and replaced with a 13-year-old Emperor Ai who was designated Tang 80, the name a posthumous irony, since Ai in Chinese carries the meaning of sorrow. There was nothing left to mourn except the form. On June 1, 907 AD, Emperor Ai issued a formal abdication edict. Zhu Wen received it, accepted the imperial seal, and declared the founding of the later Yang Dynasty. The Tang Dynasty, which had governed China for 289 years, had ended. The historical question is not why 907 AD. Any date between 876 and 907 AD could have served as the end. The question is why the Tang, the dynasty of Taizong and Xuanzong, of Li Bai and Du Fu, of the world's largest city and the most elaborate Silk Road in history, was so structurally vulnerable that a single rebellion by a frontier general could reduce it from the greatest civilization on Earth to a hollowed administrative fiction in a single decade, from which it never genuinely recovered. The answer the scholarship gives is not one thing, but a sequence of connected failures, each one making the next more likely and more severe. The Fubing's collapse created the Jiedushi system, which concentrated military power in regional commanders independent of central control. The Jiedushi system made An Lushan possible. An Lushan's rebellion was made catastrophic by Xuanzong's execution of the 2 generals who had the Tongguan Pass defended, a decision so catastrophically wrong that even contemporaries recognized it immediately. And by the palace's 60 years of cultivating a Sogdian-Turkic general's personal loyalty, while never building institutional mechanisms that would outlast any individual's trust. The rebellion's aftermath made the eunuch military commanders necessary, which hollowed the court. The Uyghur dependency drained the treasury and demonstrated that the Tang could not fight for itself even when it wanted to. The accumulated deterioration of the tax base, the flight of peasants from the northeast after 763 AD, and the failure to reconstruct a coherent revenue system left the state chronically underfunded. The Huang Chao rebellion found a dynasty that had been managing its own dysfunction for a century and had run out of the capacity to absorb another shock. Twitchett, writing in the Cambridge History, identifies the An Lushan rebellion as the moment when the Tang's structural contradictions became acute, when the choice between centralizing power and managing the frontier professionally became unavoidable, and when the Tang made every wrong choice simultaneously. What the Tang tried to do, in the century and a half after 763 AD, was recover the forms of the pre-rebellion empire without recovering the substance. It kept the administrative titles. It kept the examination system. It kept the court rituals. It kept issuing poetry prizes and translation projects and tributary protocols. But it could not keep the armies loyal, the provinces revenue-generating, the borders secure, or the court free from the factional paralysis of eunuch commanders and competing warlords. Du Fu, who survived the An Lushan rebellion and spent his final years as a wandering refugee in the south, wrote a poem called Spring View, composed in Chang'an during the occupation. The nation is broken, the mountains and rivers remain. Grass and trees grow deep in the empty city. Flowers shed tears over the times. Birds startle at the parting of hearts. 3 months of beacon fires. A letter from home worth 10,000 gold pieces. His white hair, rubbed thin by worry, can barely hold the hairpin. The mountains and rivers did remain. But the civilization that had organized them, the Silk Road culture, the cosmopolitan city, the dynasty confident enough to absorb Sogdian musicians and Persian glass and Buddhist scripture without anxiety, did not come back. What came after the Tang was not the Tang's recovery. It was something new being built from the Tang's wreckage, and the building of it was violent, complicated, and took another half-century. The Tang's last chapter ends with Zhu Wen's abdication ceremony of 907 AD. The next chapter begins immediately, in the same year, in the same territory, with the same warlords who had been the Tang's final decades. Zhu Wen's later Liang was the first of 5 successive dynasties that would govern northern China between 907 and 960 AD. Each one lasting between 4 and 17 years. Each one founded by a military commander who had destroyed his predecessor. Each one claiming to be the legitimate heir of the Tang's central authority, and none of them convincing anyone for long. 5 dynasties in 53 years is a pace of collapse and reconstruction that even the most tumultuous periods of Chinese history rarely match. But those 53 years were not simply destructive. They were also the period in which the institutions that would make the Song dynasty possible were being tested, refined, and sometimes accidentally invented. The civil service examination, the idea of governance by scholar officials rather than military governors, the economic structures of the Yangtze Valley that had survived when the North was destroyed, all of these were developing in the South during the 5 dynasties period, in the 10 smaller states that occupied southern China, while the North convulsed through its succession of dynasties. When Zhao Quanjian unified China in 960 AD and founded the Song dynasty, he was not starting from nothing. He was building on the southern foundations that the Tang's collapse had driven southward, on the administrative lessons the 5 dynasties had taught at enormous cost, and on the explicit decision to never again create the military governor independence that had destroyed the Tang. The Song's solution to the Tang's problem, civilian supremacy over the military, fiscal centralization, the restriction of military commanders' autonomous power, would define Chinese governance for the next 3 centuries. It would also create its own vulnerabilities, which is a different story. What matters here is that the road to the Song runs directly through the 50 years of the 5 dynasties, and the 5 dynasties begin in the specific, traceable moment when Zhu Wen sat down in Luoyang on June 1, 907 AD, received the abdication edict of a 13-year-old emperor, and decided that the Tang had been over long enough to say so. The next video in this series covers exactly that, the 5 dynasties, how China's most violent 50 years built the Song Empire. 5 dynasties, 10 states, the warlords who remade China from the Tang's ruins, and the single decision by a military coup leader who put down his sword and became the founder of one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the medieval world. The 5 dynasties follow directly from what you have just seen. The Tang's collapse is not an ending. It is the first act of a reconstruction that cost 50 years and millions more lives before China found a shape that could hold. 0000 00. The numbers that cannot be true 00, 04, 30. The dynasty at its peak. Xuanzong's golden age 00, 09, 15. The Fubing's collapse and the rise of the Jiedushi 00, 14, 00. An Lushan. The man Xuanzong trusted 00, 19, 30. December 755. The rebellion begins 00, 25, 00. Mawei. The Emperor and the Silk Scarf 00, 30, 30. The Uyghur Alliance and the cost of rescue 00, 36, 00. Structural collapse. Eunuchs, silk debt and fragmented sovereignty 00, 41, 30. Huang Chao. The salt-smuggler who burned Chang'an 00, 47, 00. Zhu Wen and the final years 00, 51, 30. Why the Tang could not recover. Twitchett's analysis 00, 55, 00. The five dynasties begin the numbers that cannot be true, the demographic catastrophe as entry point. Census figures 53M to 17M, situating the An Lushan rebellion among premodern disasters, the dynasty at its peak. Xuanzong's golden age, Chang'an as the world's largest city, Silk Road commerce, Lai Bai and Du Fu, the cosmopolitan Tang, Xuanzong's 3 decades of genuine achievement, Yang Guifei, the Fubing's collapse and the rise of the Jiedushi, why the conscript system broke down under multi-front frontier pressure, the structural shift to professional standing armies under regional military governors, the institutional time bomb An Lushan, the man Xuanzong trusted, Sogdian-Turkic origins, rise through the frontier officer corps, cultivation of imperial favor, command of 3 northeastern armies, Yang Guifei's warnings dismissed. December 755. The rebellion begins, the march south from Fanyang, the execution of Gao Xianji and Feng Chengqing at Tongguan, the fall of Luoyang and Chang'an, the speed of catastrophe caused by the court's own errors Mawei, the Emperor and the Silk Scarf, the flight to Sichuan, the mutiny at Mawei Station, Yang Guifei's death, the forced execution of Yang Guifei, the inversion of imperial authority, the Uyghur alliance and the cost of rescue, Prince Xuanzong at Lingwu, the alliance with the Uyghur Khaganate, the retaking of Chang'an and Luoyang, the 3-day sackings, the Silk Four Horses debt that drained the treasury for a century, the rebellion's continuation under Shi Siming until 763 AD, structural collapse, eunuchs, silk debt and fragmented sovereignty, the Northeast's autonomy, Jiedushi as hereditary military governors, eunuch command of the Shen's army, the Uyghur tributary crisis until 840 AD, the Tang governing its own dysfunction Huang Chao, the salt-smuggler who burned Chang'an, the Wang Xianji rebellion, Huang Chao's southern campaign, the Guangzhou massacre, the march on Chang'an, the occupation 880–884 AD, Lai Qiang's Shachuo cavalry and the expulsion Zhu Wen and the final years, the defector who became the most powerful warlord, the eunuch massacre of 903 AD, Emperor Xuanzong's assassination, the abdication of Emperor Ai on June 1, 907 AD, the founding of the later Liang, why the Tang could not recover, Twitchett's analysis, the sequence of connected failures from Fubing to Jiedushi to An Lushan to eunuch commanders, institutional forms maintained without institutional substance, Du Fu's spring view as elegy, the 5 dynasties begin. The transition to the next video. 53 years of succession violence as the construction cost of the Song dynasty.